My father, Robert Ager Sr., was a professional carer for over 20 years. Amongst other things, he worked as a psychiatric nurse and as a counsellor to drug addicts and alcoholics. In his late 30s, he began to exhibit delusional thoughts that increasingly disrupted his everyday living. He and my mother had divorced, he developed arthritis, and his relationships with most of his family had deteriorated. Due to these problems, my father was housed at this property in 1996. This was arranged by a charity called Adullam Housing Association. His career caring for others was over, and it was now he who needed care, but he was still only 41 years old. In his early years at this address, he became very reclusive. He was also an outpatient at a psychiatric clinic. Because he was unemployed and liked to get out of his flat, he would visit me at my flat on the other side of the city, usually once or twice a week. Due to my own work schedule, I was unable to keep a check on how he was coping with his domestic self-care. But since he was receiving weekly home visits from Adullam Housing support staff, I assumed that any problems would be addressed professionally. At some point during this time, my father began drinking heavily, despite having been pretty much a teetotaler all of his life, and by 2007 his dependency on alcohol had overshadowed his mental health problems. In the early months of 2008, he had an alcohol-induced seizure and was taken to hospital. While he was in hospital, I went to collect some of his belongings for him. It was the first time I'd been in his flat for several years. The living conditions that I discovered on that day indicated that my father's health had drastically deteriorated. I took these photographs of his living conditions. It was obvious that my father was incapable of supporting himself in the community, so I began making inquiries as to what could be done for him. My father explained that Tricia Jordan, his support worker from Adullam, only visited him for 15 minutes each week, and that some weeks she didn't show up at all. In the months that followed, I attended several meetings with my father at Hague Road Mental Health Centre, where he was an outpatient. I provided the community psychiatric nurse with a 6-page report of my father's living conditions. These included the following: heavily soiled carpets, walls, kitchen surfaces and bathroom facilities, poor diet, repeatedly eating of the same dirty dishes, dozens of empty beer cans scattered about the flat, heavily stained and odorous clothes and towels, a heavily soiled radiator in his bedroom, varnished window panes throughout the flat, which my father explained he had done to keep himself warm, and dampened carpets in the communal halls. Then, of course, there were all the additional issues, such as social isolation, alcoholism, suicide attempts, and a violent beating that he had received in his neighbourhood. Staff from the Hague Road Clinic then visited my father's flat to confirm what I'd reported. Immediately, they began seeking out alternative care options. Over the following months, I attended most of my father's meetings at the Hague Road Clinic. The support worker from Adullam Housing attended the first couple of these meetings, during which she openly admitted that she only visited my father for 15 minutes per week. She claimed that she was contracted to provide him with 2 hours support per visit, but that her travel time had to be included in the 2 hours. Being that she was a driver, I found it very difficult to believe that it took her 1 hour and 45 minutes travel time for each visit. Another issue raised in these meetings was that my father repeatedly cited loneliness and isolation as major causes of his problems, especially his drinking, and so it was mutually agreed that sheltered accommodation would be his best living option. Sheltered accommodation basically involves a group of vulnerable adults living together in a shared building, each with their own individual flat, with support staff available on the premises 24 hours a day. This helps them to socially reintegrate. During the drawn-out process of having my father rehoused, he explained to me that his support worker from Adullam was trying to persuade him to stay in the flat where he was, rather than move into sheltered accommodation. I also observed this in meetings that Tricia attended. She was preoccupied with the idea that providing new furniture and redecorating his flat would somehow reverse his physical and mental health deterioration. The social isolation issues seemed irrelevant to her. It took over 6 months for a sheltered housing placement to become available, but eventually it was arranged that my father would move into a sheltered accommodation project called The Beeches. This property was also located much closer to where I lived, which would allow me more frequent contact with him. In the meantime, my father began to talk less and less about his psychotic delusions. He became less paranoid and was more willing to confide in health professionals. In my opinion, these improvements were due to the simple fact that he had something to look forward to. But unfortunately, he was still struggling with alcoholism, and he had several more seizures. On September 23, 2008, he was found dead in his flat by a neighbour. This was just 6 days before he was due to move into sheltered accommodation. The pathologist recorded an accidental death induced by an accumulated overdose of paroxetine, also known as Seroxat, which is a highly addictable antidepressant. He was just 52 years of age. A few days after his death, my brother and I returned to his flat and recorded this video of his living conditions. As you get up here, there's a really strong smell. As you can see, the carpet's